Hey, this is Alvin, and welcome to 3D Modeling with ZBrush, an introduction. So in this short tutorial, what we're going to take a look at is file types. We'll do a slight recap of what we've gone over so far, and then we'll get into some of the various file types, focusing on the ones you'll need for your assignment. All right, so here we are at the geometry that we created before. We know that this geometry has 6 subdivision levels, and if we want to see what the polygons are doing, we can turn on polyframing, which is Shift F if you are interested in the shortcut, and then we can hit the D key, D as in David, to go up the subdivision stack, or Shift D to go down the subdivision stack. Those are the hotkeys. Of course, you can just use the slider as well. So we know that this is not part of the background. This is not either 2D or 2.5D, which is essentially 2D with an alpha channel, a Z depth as an alpha channel. Like, we'll talk about that later, perhaps in class. But this is geometry. So if you wanted to save just the geometry, you would save a tool. And so if we look under subtool, we can see that there's one object, a single tool, and we can save that tool by just going up here to the tool menu and saying save as, and we can give this tool a name, and then we can go ahead and save it. I'm not going to do that because I want to show you a couple other things. And so we can save a tool, and what does that do? It saves the entire stack. So it saves all 6 subdivision levels, and it would save, if I had more than one tool, it would save those as well. We just have a single tool on our canvas at the moment, so it'll just save that. And so when I open it in ZBrush again, I'll have whatever my document default is, and on top of that, my geometry, my tool. So what I can also do is I can export. Now, when you export an OBJ file, which is just a single level on the subdivision stack. So for instance, if I went to geometry, I could save this geometry at subdivision level 1, and it would be a certain size. And then I could save the geometry at subdivision level 6, which would be a lot more and a lot larger file. The thing is that I would just save those instances of the geometry and not the whole stack. So that's not, saving an OBJ file isn't quite that useful for us. We're more interested in saving a tool. So that is one of the file types, the ZTL file type or the tool file type. Another file type under file is the project file type. And so I can save this entire project, which would save some of the environment settings as well. And that is useful for a couple of things, but maybe not so useful if you're just sharing the tool. Like, we don't need all of this other information if we're just sharing the geometry. So we don't need the background, and we don't need any other settings that our environment might have. So a tool might not be that useful. But there is something that is useful about the project format that you can't save in just the ZTL format. So we talked a little bit before about this undo history, right? And so we know that our file has an undo history, but if I were to close this file, and I haven't yet, if I were to close this file, the file would likely by default save without the undo history. But what I can do is I can go up here into file, and I can say, I can activate this undo history, and it will end up saving a larger file with all the undo history, right? Now the thing about this is that it could end up being a much larger file, like it could be gigs and gigs of undo history and instances of your geometry in certain sets. in a certain state, rather. So if we were to save just a file here without the undo history, it'd be quite small. But if we were to save a file here with all the additional subdivision levels and all the modeling that we've done, it would be a lot larger file, right? So be careful when you save your files. You always want to save with geometry, so you don't want to save just the document. You always want to save either a ZTL or a ZPR. And the thing that you'll be sharing with your group, we'll talk about groups a little later in the class, is typically a ZTL, unless you're really late in production and you start doing lighting, or you have like a very specific setup that you have to share as well. In that case, a ZPR file might be more optimal. Now, I just mentioned the document. So if I went here under document and I chose to save as, let's look at that dialog again. So if I went here, save as, it'll give me this dialog, and it'll say, a tool is currently in edit or transfer mode. Would you like to save the document or save the active tool? If I went to save the active tool, it would save like we know, it would end up saving as ZTL file. But if I were to save a document, it's just it's essentially a ZBrush rendered file, which is a snapshot of the canvas. So it's a 2D file, right? So let's just save this and just call it test. Test 2D and save. And let's go to File, and we'll save this with undo history, and we'll call this test undo and save. And we know that the extension is ZPR, which is a project file. And then we will save our tool, and we'll call that test and underscore tool. And let's see if we saved everything. We've saved with our history. Let's try to save without the history. And so if I go to File and then turn off undo history and save as, so test, and we'll just say no undo. No undo, save. And then I'm going to go into the Save As dialog again, just so I can show you the differences in file size. And so if you look at this, let's just close this up. We don't need this. If you look at this, this is without the undo history. So it's just our model with subdivision levels, the 6 subdivision levels, and the final instance, right? This is where we are in the history timeline. And so this, which is almost 10 times the size of this one, has multiple history instances, and it has not only the first, which has no subdivision levels, but it has all the way up to the last, which has all the subdivision levels, right? And we can load our subtool, and then I can show you the size of that. So this is our subtool, which is essentially the size of our file without the history. It's a little smaller. And if I open that, oh, I should select it first and then open it. You can see that it is essentially this. And what I can do is I can append, sorry, let's click and hold on that, append the test tool to this one. And you can see that, sorry, that they're essentially the same, right? They actually are in the same space, so it's hard to tell. This is just 2D because I went from one tool to another, and I can just clear this like we've seen before, just clear. And since I'm in edit mode, we can just take a look at this one. Actually, because they are the same file, it's really hard to see. So it would be a good idea for me to introduce polygroups, because then I could show you the difference between these two in color. And so there's this thing called polygroups. And let us just, before we do that, let's go to Subtool and make sure that we only have one on the screen. And so polygroups we'll talk a little bit about later, but polygroups end up being kind of masking by polygons, essentially grouping polygons in a way where you can select them and hide them and do all sorts of things, but we'll talk about that later. All we're interested in now is changing the color so we can see that they are in fact two distinct subtools on the screen at the same time. So I'm going to group by visible, which will just give it another color. And I clicked it twice because I wanted a color that was very different than the green. And let's go back up to subtools. And so we know that this one is the test tool, the one that we saved as a tool and imported again and then appended to this tool. And that one is the original. So you can see two. All right. What else did we save? So we saved the tool. We know that a tool is a little bit smaller than a ZPR file if you're not saving history, and that the ZPR file has additional information, ZBrush environment information that we probably are not interested in. The last thing I think we want to do is take a look at the document and pull in a document. So I'm going to open, and I'm not going to save. And I'm going to take this, this 2D file. Now you can see how small this file is. Mouse. You can see how small this file is compared to the files, the ZTL file and the ZPR file that we saved that we know has geometry in it. This is a ZBR file, which is ZBrush render file, and it's just 2D. So we open that. And we can see as we hover that there's no geometry, right? It's just 2D information. Now these are our subtools that we haven't drawn on the screen yet. And if we take a look under layer, we can see that there's this, it's just an image. And the image has, sorry, if we roll over that again, the image has some information. It has, if we go down the list, there's layer, show, hide, width, and height of our document. And under depth, there's 32-bit depth, 32. And there is material information, which is essentially color information, RGB, right? So no geometry at all. And we can't select or move anything, and we certainly aren't in edit mode. So those are the things that tell us that we have no geometry. But if we want to put geometry, we select a tool and we draw it on the screen, and then we go into edit mode. Right? So hopefully I'll be able to show you something interesting here. So you can see that this geometry looks like it's passing through this 2D image. And the reason that it looks like that is because the 2D image has an alpha on it. Now you might know an alpha from working in Photoshop or Nuke or After Effects or any other compositing program, that the alpha allows us to create a mask, and the mask allows us to shift things in and out or behind other objects, 2D objects in that case. But in this case, it's a 3D object. And the alpha that we have on the green cube image is a special alpha in that it has Z-depth information. So essentially what Z-depth information is, it's a grayscale that follows the depth of our scene. And we are able to take our geometry and sort of put it within this 2D document, or within this 2D cube, because it has this mask on it that follows the depth information of our previous render. At any rate, let's just do a quick recap because we've talked about a couple things. So we've talked about file types. We know that the major ones are ZTL, which is the tool file, which is just geometry. ZPR, which is a project file that also contains environment settings, and it may also contain the document, the 2D background. We talked about a ZBR file, B as in boy, R file, and that is a 2D render that can sometimes contain a not only material information, but also an alpha channel, and an alpha channel is essentially a mask, and that mask, in our case, is based on 3D depth information, which allows us to do this, right? But in that we can only select and move one thing on the screen, we know that this other thing is not geometry. At any rate, I hope that helps. If you have any questions, please post them in the forum. Other than that, I'll see you in the classroom.